I don't know if you know this, but I have a book available for pre-orders coming October 29th called Rebels Creed. You can go pre-order if you want to, and the link's down below. Okay, bye, good. Let's go to the video now, bye. So this next One Piece arc is quite large, which means I can't get through it in just 1 week, and that means you are getting One Piece filler content. And that's something you're gonna be used to. Because if you're watching this, I'm gonna go ahead and assume you're a bit of a One Piece fan, or at least curious about the franchise. And I'm gonna be addressing what I believe, up until the point I have read a little bit past Dressrosa, are the biggest weaknesses One Piece has as a series. And if you're one of these people who's like, hey man, it's flawless and you can't convince me otherwise. The anime's pacing after a certain point, as well as filler arcs that add nothing. Boom, right in the low-hanging fruit. You want another one? Thriller bark! Kapow! Right in the low-hanging fruit! Oh, do you still want another one? The drawing and depiction of female characters. That's another pretty big one. But those are just kind of some surface level, easy to talk about stuff that the fan base is very aware of. I have also seen some stuff that's a bit more nuanced that goes beyond just surface level, kind of very easy to observe problems. And I'm going to get into that now and here. This will be spoiler free because I can really articulate all my points without getting into specific plot details. So let's start with the first and probably my most controversial point. As with many fantasy epics, which is something I'm a bit familiar with, this one's right here! The author is extremely indulgent, and Oda, after reading some interviews and watching some Grand Line review videos, seems to be someone who can't really tell himself no creatively, and that has resulted in One Piece not only lasting far longer than was originally planned, but it's resulted in some problems with the overall pacing and structure of the series. I love One Piece. I would genuinely put it in my top 10 fantasy series at this point, but ugh, it's kind of weird to see fans talk about online like, really, it's kind of like the perfect manga. I'm sorry, did Dressrosa need to be that long? I don't think so. Why did Oda include all this themes and stuff around children being experimented on just to drop it at the end of the arc and have no greater relevance towards the overall series, at least where I'm at so far? It's because he doesn't always plan things completely through. And after seeing interviews where the guy talks about like, yeah, just late at night I decided to include this character because it felt right, and I also created 4 more characters that night that I liked and I just included in the arc, it's clear that he's going to continually have this problem. What I will say as a compliment is he's a extraordinarily good last-minute fumbler togetherer. Like, it's genuinely amazing that the entire cast of The Worst Generation was like kind of something he just spat out, and they've become so relevant and crucial to the story even where I'm at. But I think it's just almost objectively true to say at this point, One Piece would have benefited from being a bit more condensed and trimmed down, and the fact that we see so much bloat is kind of one of the biggest sores to the series. And this actually leads me to a feeling I have that I just don't know how One Piece is going to end and satisfy everything Oda has set up, because from the 7 Warlords of the Sea to Blackbeard to Law and the crew and all their different motivations and arcs, it just feels like, how could this all come to an end? And with Oda being someone who clearly is kind of just scrambling all these things together, even if he has an end in mind, it can be extraordinarily difficult to even impossible to bring it all to a satisfactory resolution. One Piece is without question a fantasy epic, which is actually something we're going to touch on later in this video, but I think some people are unaware of how rare it is for huge fantasy epics to come to completely satisfactory conclusions. It's one of the biggest hurdles for creatives of the genre. It's really hard to do. I'm not saying it won't be. I'm just saying I will be extremely impressed if it is an ending that almost the entire fan base can agree is satisfactory. Notice I did not say everyone, because that's impossible. That is impossible. You cannot make all your fans happy. So I guess the first point could be summarized with, Oda needs to learn to tell himself no. The second major criticism I have is going to feel like it's a surface level one, but it's going to actually tie into a larger problem that is the third point. And the second one, I'm just going to say, the anime, it's at least where I've gotten in Dressrosa, has borderline become unwatchable with how much they are clearly just trying to stretch all content, because yes, Oda is just continuing this series far beyond what I'm sure the show thought would be, so they're just caught up, and now they're like, And so they keep just bloating things. And yeah, it's kind of made it so every time, like every few chapters or so, I check in on the anime, it is a worse experience than reading the manga. Like pretty much just by far, because they are just trying to inflate what they can. The final point I want to talk about, though, and this is going to be one I think many people will understand, but a lot of people will probably be frustrated or angry at hearing, and that is that One Piece is extremely hard for me to recommend to other people for many reasons, and not just the length and the pacing and structure that can be a struggle, like I've already talked about. The humor as well can often be so cringy that, like, I just imagine one of my friends getting through it and being like, Daniel recommended this Sanji nosebleed thing. This is something he thinks is worth recommending to me. Like, it's just like, oh god, yeah. And then there, yes, is the depiction of women and just a lot of over-the-top moments that, don't get me wrong, I love the absurdity and humor of One Piece a lot of the time. It has genuinely made me laugh as hard as, like, Discworld, which I think is the funniest fantasy series ever. I mean, this little shot alone is just on surface value hilarious, even without the context of who the character is and everything like that. But while the highs are so high, the lows can be so low for this series in terms of just frustratingly terrible humor. And I'm sure some of it is a translation issue or cultural differences, and I'm very willing to admit and address that. But to me, it's just like, you can't invalidate that, yeah, it's uncomfortable for me to read this stuff. And if you don't share that, great. I'm glad people can get through this and either find it funny or it just doesn't bother them. But for me, I don't really see myself recommending this to a lot of my friends because I know they will just hate a lot of the humor. But now I actually want to go to a meta criticism of the series that actually more or less falls on the fans. And this is going to be one that is actually me lifting One Piece up, well, lecturing the audience. I hope that's okay. And that's specifically around how the series is talked about and the fact that it's very hard to pin down in the wider fantasy landscape, because in terms of the fantasy world built throughout this over 1,000 chapters, it's up there with some of the biggest and baddest of all time. And I've done a repeated comparison to Malazan, which I immediately get pushback for every time. Let me further explain myself. I'm not saying that tonally or setting-wise it feels anything like Malazan. It absolutely is not and doesn't. But what I am saying in terms of the two authors' approach to crafting characters and factions and ideas within their series are extremely similar. I'm not just talking about how big the world is. I'm talking about the ideas and people within it. Erikson is a writer who every character he puts in, to me at least in my reading, has a direct purpose to complement themes or ideas within the text. Not every author is as efficient with their character utilization. And I find Oda to be, especially with his star cast as well. He defines very clear lines between different factions and characters, and often people who are against each other. They're not just against each other in the literal ideas of the page, but their personality and philosophies of who they are as individuals is also thoroughly explored, and it's the same for both series. We then also have the way the world is explored, and I find Malazan's different dropping in and just learning, figuring out as you are introduced to these different landscapes also feels rather One Piece-esque, and its approach to world building I enjoy, where every island you just kind of get this new reintroductory. The only through line is One Piece has the same cast going about. Well, in Malazan, you're often not quite as lucky as to have the same full cast appear everywhere. So when I say One Piece is Malazan-esque, I mean it in a less literal sense of the narrative and more of just the approach of the author into crafting their fantastical worlds. But this is actually the criticism I'm getting at. One Piece kind of exists in this middle ground where it does belong in conversations with many of the biggest, baddest fantasy series of all time in terms of its world development. It has this very soft, squishy approach towards fantasy elements that I think is so valid in the modern fantasy world building conversation, especially in a day and age where so much of fantasy is dedicated to hard magic systems. It's been really nice to see this softer one with some rules. It's not the softest ever, horror really come into play. And as I've started to learn what haki is better, that's been another very fun element. But because One Piece is manga, I don't see many of its fans bringing it up in these bigger fantasy conversations, which kind of drives me nuts, because so much of what I've been talking about for fantasy for years on this channel, I can provide awesome examples from with One Piece. But people don't do that, and I feel they should, and I get weird looks if I bring, or weird comments I should say, if I bring One Piece into that conversation, because people act like it's totally removed from the fantasy genre when the only difference is it's a manga, not just a novel. Does that make sense? And that's why I provided the example of the Malazan to One Piece comparison, because people just go, wow, it's manga, it's not comparable at all. It is. Intent of the writer comes through so strong in both series, and I love the idea of comparing and contrasting these two. And I also got told continually that, like, One Piece is the Wheel of Time of manga, which I wasn't sure if that was people just trying to convince me to read it by saying that, or if that's something fans actually say. I don't really know. But that's how you got me as a reader to look at it, by putting it validly within the wider fantasy conversation. So I want to encourage fans to do that more. I will absolutely be doing a video essay in the future where I talk about humor in Discworld versus One Piece. And I think it'll be a wonderful video where I'm able to talk about things other people haven't, because no one's doing that with One Piece yet. And so in a day and age where fantasy is finally being looped in with many of the more seriously taken genres, because people are realizing that adding fantasy elements does not invalidate theming in a literary discussion, since I'm also trying to encourage doing the same thing for manga, because manga is just as valid as just your standard literature, and I want to push back on the ideas that it somehow isn't, because yeah, I want to encourage people to realize that manga has just as much to offer often as regular books and literature and novels. I phrased that weird, but you get what I'm saying. So in summation, I wish Oda, or Goda as you all like to refer to him as, would practice more self-restraint when it comes to writing One Piece. He seems to be kind of a just go along and include things as they pop in his mind writer, which can be great if you have a lot of it planned out, but it seems he has gone off the path he intended, and he's just wandering around at times. I think One Piece's humor can make the series kind of hard to recommend, but the biggest takeaway from this video is I want to see more mangas brought into the wider fantasy conversation, and I encourage people to do that because it's a medium that's valid, and its best material should be considered in the conversation with the wider fantasy genre's best material. Manga is not a genre, it's a medium, so it's totally fine to bring up fantasy mangas within the conversation of fantasy. But anyway, let me know what you thought of this video in the comments down below. Like and subscribe if you have not already, and hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. Have a good one, y'all. Peace.